of the North American and global trade agendas. And at the moment, I'll be honest, I'm seeing a lot more challenges than opportunities today in particular. But, you know, NAFTA is back on the front page of the paper, and in a way that it really hasn't been for decades. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the general trends that I see, but I'm not going to get into sort of deep state of play stuff, and I'm not going to talk about leaked documents, and I'm not going to talk about what the president said last week or last night. The reality is that every day brings new developments on this file, and much of, I think, what's discussed and reported in the media is actually just a very small part of the picture, and sometimes it's actually a distraction from the real agenda. And I know this from experience. I worked as Foreign Affairs and Trade Advisor to Stephen Harper for a number of years, and so I've seen what's in the paper, and I know what's not. I'm going to relate some of the specific issues, though, to what I see as the big picture, both for North American trade as well as for the larger global trade system. And then after I outline that context, I'd like to focus on the future. I'll advance the argument that I think that we're too short-sighted in our approach to trade negotiations on both sides of the border, and I'll advocate for a stronger focus on ensuring that today's trade negotiations work for our citizens in the future. So the first trend that I see today is kind of stating the obvious, which is that uncertainty about trade in some parts of the Western world is pretty high. There's a number of reasons for that. Some of them are well-founded. Some of them are totally unrelated to trade, but trade is an easy target. Now, this uncertainty is manifesting in different ways in different parts of the globe. So in the United States, much of the concern is about the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector and the role that trade has played in that. I'm not one of those people that's going to tell you that it's all automation and that it has nothing to do with trade. The evidence simply doesn't support such a simplistic picture. Absolutely, without question, technological change has led to major advances in automation that have reduced the number of routine assembly and manufacturing jobs available in this country, but as Autor and colleagues from MIT have demonstrated in their work on offshoring to China, trade has also played a role in specific sectors, especially manufacturing. Now, the forces of globalization, trade, and automation, as well as some other domestic factors, have contributed to the reduction of 7 million manufacturing jobs in the U.S. since the 80s. But because these forces all sort of took place around the same period, the number of jobs lost directly attributable to trade is actually still not very well understood. And I'll also note that even in the absence of free trade agreements, as is currently the case between the United States and China, job losses due to globalization and import competition still happen. But that trade has been implicated in job losses shouldn't be a surprise. Free trade advocates never claimed anything different. It's always been argued that trade agreements would produce winners and losers, but overall society would be better off and losers would gain access to the new opportunities created through trade. And indeed, today, as it's measured in the United States, that's true. GDP continues to rise year over year, as do a series of other macroeconomic factors. On paper, the U.S. is richer than ever before, and some of this is due to trade. While some jobs in specific sectors have been lost, other jobs have been added in high-wage sectors, especially in product development and head-office jobs. But of course, we know that this macro picture can disguise losses. And the availability of an IT developer job in California is cold comfort to the line worker in Pittsburgh who's just lost his job. And so, while trade adjustment assistance programs have existed in both of our countries for over 50 years, they don't appear to be working very well. This was discussed a little bit this morning. I had a group of master's students examine the trade adjustment assistance program in the United States this past winter. And what they found is that while the program appears to have been somewhat helpful in assisting displaced workers to find new jobs, not surprisingly, those new jobs generally paid significantly less. In addition, displaced workers who received training in high-demand occupations were also more likely to be reemployed, but those occupations were often in what are considered to be pink jobs. So this tended to have a positive impact on women's reemployment and reorientation away from manufacturing and into healthcare and office roles, but it didn't work out really well for everyone. So as I reviewed these findings, what became clear to me is that there remains a deep disconnect between the original promises made to workers in order to generate support for trade agreements and the follow-through on how trade adjustment programs are working in practice. That doesn't necessarily mean the trade agreements themselves are bad, or that even the trade adjustment assistance offers were insufficient, but if those programs don't result in positive employment outcomes for displaced workers, then I think maybe it's time to revisit those programs. So what else is happening elsewhere? Well, in Europe, anti-trade sentiment has also grown for other reasons. Several recent high-profile elections have contributed to this sentiment. In addition, Brexit will be the major focus of both the EU and Britain for the foreseeable future. Some of you might have followed Canada's path to ratify our trade agreement with the European Union, what we call CETA. And if you did, you'll know that its ratification came to a grinding halt last year over investor-state dispute settlement in a sub-region of Belgium called Wallonia. Now, what you might not know is that Europe's concerns about those provisions of CETA stem not from Europe's concerns with Canada, but from its concerns about Europe's impending trade deal with the United States via TTIP. Europeans were deeply concerned about what they view as a litigious tendency among American firms to use the courts to undermine the health and safety of citizens, and they wanted to ensure that CETA wouldn't be a path for that. So this example highlights, I think, one of the ways in which for Canada, the U.S. is always in the room, even when you're not at the table. But Canada's keen awareness of this fact and the protection of our trading relationship with the U.S. can also be used to benefit our two countries. For example, when we negotiated autos in CETA, we were extremely conscious of the integrated North American supply chain and the fact that a significant portion of most Canadian cars contain American parts and American labor. So it was very important for Canada to ensure that we negotiated an auto rule of origin with Europe that would not preclude NAFTA-assembled vehicles from being exported tariff-free to Europe. We didn't do this to help the United States. We did this because it made sense for Canada and our Canadian auto industry. And we deeply value the North American supply chain. We had no idea at the time that TTIP would stall badly, or that UK would Brexit, or that the United States would think about maybe threatening the NAFTA rule of origin. But now as I look at the state of global trade, I see that U.S. automakers can actually benefit from the rule that Canada negotiated in CETA. Of course, if changes are made to the NAFTA rule of origin to increase U.S. content at the expense of Canadian content, this advantage may disappear. Similarly, as I think about TPP-1, I worry about what it will mean for Mexico and Canada on the auto rule of origin. And I talk about that not for the benefit of those of you who know about the auto rule of origin and what it would mean in TPP-1, but for those of you in the room who have heard maybe there's going to be a TPP-1 and that sounds like maybe a really good idea for Canada, but it'll actually be very complicated if Canada joins TPP-1 without the United States. Now, it's also important to note that the anti-trade sentiment that I've been talking about is really a Western phenomenon for the most part, being experienced among developed economies. Trade remains quite popular throughout most of Asia, and Asia is still growing, although more slowly than it has been. The days of double-digit growth for China are over, but it's still projected to grow 6% this year and next. So Southeast Asian countries are keen to sign new trade agreements, and of course, China's leading its own multinational alternative to the TPP called RCEP. And while it's not nearly as comprehensive as TPP, and it actually has some pretty serious problems, right now it's the only game in town. Now, Canada also hasn't really been bitten by the anti-trade bug just yet. And we're in the process, our officials, of engaging in exploratory discussions with China. So what do I think all of this means for our relationship between Canada and the U.S. moving forward? And I guess the first thing I would say is that not all trade deals are created equal, and not all trade relationships should be viewed with the same lens. While U.S. manufacturing is going through a difficult period, I think most of us in this room know that it's not Canada's fault. U.S. companies are not leaving the U.S. to set up in Canada, and we're simply just not a very attractive offshoring destination. We also don't pose the typical regulatory problems for the U.S. that result in cheap import competition. We have strong labor and environment laws. We continuously seek to align our regulatory frameworks with yours to facilitate faster and easier trade. And although our two countries have our share of minor bilateral disputes, a number of those have been spoken about today, overall I think we have a very good relationship. But when I try to read the tea leaves on where I think NAFTA negotiations are going, I worry very much about them being scoped too broadly. There are certain issues to address in NAFTA. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was supposed to modernize several of those. For example, some areas of NAFTA that I think can be solved almost immediately include the insertion of 3 chapters from TPP into NAFTA. Those would be labor, environment, and e-commerce chapters. Doing this will ensure that those areas of NAFTA can be enforced and that Mexico observes the same set of rules on environment and labor that are already commonplace in Canada and the US. And the Wild West of digital commerce will come under international trade rules. According to the US Census Bureau, US e-commerce sales account for 8% of retail sales in this country. In addition, PricewaterhouseCoopers projects that Mexico will be the 9th largest country in the world by 2030. So as more Mexicans join the middle class, start using credit cards and purchase goods and services online, Mexico represents an enormous e-commerce market for both of our countries. And the reason that we can adopt these 3 chapters into NAFTA swiftly is because there's already agreed text between our countries, and while they're not perfect, it's not a perfect text, I think it can gain the support that it needs to pass. But depending on how much more broadly the negotiations are scoped and how politically controversial those areas are, it could take years to achieve a broader deal. And as a bit of an aside, I would say that it's important to not lose sight of the fact that TPP was finalized by political predecessors in both of our countries. So just as President Trump has withdrawn from TPP, Prime Minister Trudeau has never taken an official position on TPP. And so I think it would be a mistake for anyone to assume that Canada will concede in NAFTA issues that were difficult for us in TPP. Those TPP concessions that were made by the Harper government were made in certain sectors to gain market access to the Asia Pacific, not to insert into NAFTA. But overall, I'm concerned that a focus by our 3 countries on a broad NAFTA negotiation means that we'll not be focused on other trade priorities. If NAFTA is wide open during Canada's 2019 federal election, I can't imagine Canadian voters will be happy. And as the TPP ratification process is demonstrated here in the United States, leaving trade agreements unsettled by any party during a national election is risky business. So if I can offer advice on a good strategy moving forward, it would be to keep negotiations narrow and focused and to work quickly to arrive at a deal. Now, the second issue that I worry about is whether trade negotiators and policymakers are focused on the right priorities. Trade agreements are supposed to be negotiated for the future, but too often they're fought over today's battles. And I believe that this problem will become more pronounced in the coming months. As just one example of many, I see a lot of energy being expended on the NAFTA rule of origin, as I've already talked about. But I see 2 bigger problems related to the rule of origin on the horizon. And the first issue is advanced by companies such as Apple, who design their products in the United States but assemble them offshore in countries such as China, products like the iPhone. And these companies argue that the intellectual property created in the US is not adequately reflected, and that while their products may physically be assembled overseas, these companies argue that they do create American products. So I'm going to come back to this in a moment. Now, the second issue brings us full circle back to my first comments about job loss associated with automation. And it's highlighted by the 3D printed shoe, which my students will tell you I have actually become a little bit obsessed with. Every 3 months I check the internet for who's doing new cool things with the 3D printed shoe. And I don't think that's where I want to be. So Feeds.com is now fully in business. And when you go to Feeds.com, this is what they'll tell you when you visit their website. Snap a photo or 2 of your feet with your phone. Pick out a shoe. Tell them how you like it to fit. A robot will print all the parts customized for your foot and preferences, and then humans will assemble them in America. Now, right now, these shoes are kind of pricey by my price point, $125 to $165 American per pair. But that price is inevitably going to come down, and I think that the design and sophistication and customization is going to go up. So here we have a shoe where all the real value added is performed in the United States, the design, the marketing, the sales, the final assembly. But the routine aspects of the work, the unskilled parts, are now being done by robots in the United States. So I'm not seeing a whole lot of international the 3D printed shoe to a variety of products and services, like smartphones. And if we think back to my earlier comments about the role of technology versus trade in U.S. job loss, I worry that seeking to reshore assembly operations will not actually create jobs for citizens without advanced skills. Meanwhile, major changes to rules of origin in certain sectors to fight today's political battles could cause severe disruption to current North American supply chains without creating the new growth and innovation we need to prepare ourselves for the future. And so I'm going to finish by talking about how I think we can look to trade negotiations and orient them to the future. That we're skating to where the puck is going. And while there's many ways we could do this, I'm just going to focus on one issue, which is labor mobility. And in the spirit of facilitating true cross-border labor mobility, I look to Canada's great one, dressed in the uniform of his former American employer. Well, one day, maybe no one's going to be moving around the world to work anymore, because computers are going to do everything for us, but I actually think that's a very distant future and not actually a very likely one. Instead, global companies and investors are going to continue to regard the ability to move senior employees and knowledge specialists around the world as essential to their business processes. On this, Canada has a significant advantage over the U.S. In my own research program, I've compared in detail Canada versus the U.S.'s approach to labor mobility in 25 trade agreements signed by one or both of our countries since NAFTA. For those of you who don't know this chapter of America's history, from the perspective of U.S. lawmakers, labor mobility has been regarded as a sovereignty issue to be addressed through immigration policy, not something to be negotiated in trade agreements. To put it bluntly, politicians on both sides of the aisle in the U.S. have historically believed that NAFTA's temporary entry chapter was an unfortunate experiment not to be repeated. Despite this, after a decade after NAFTA was signed, the U.S. still signed temporary entry chapters in agreements with Singapore and Chile. But even at the time those agreements were signed, U.S. Congress approved the deals on the explicit condition that no future U.S. trade agreements would contain temporary entry provisions. The U.S. has been true to this commitment, and every agreement signed thereafter contains no such commitments. In fact, most new agreements specify very clearly that any such commitments were excluded, including the TPP negotiated by Barack Obama. So while I was pleased to hear earlier today many Americans on stage saying that this issue needs to be addressed, the current administration is not offside with the historical trends of this country on temporary entry. By contrast, NAFTA started a temporary entry trend for Canada. The vast majority of our agreements signed since NAFTA contain major chapters focused on temporary entry, including those with Korea and the European Union. This includes TPP, which every country except the United States made commitments, and where half of all TPP countries, including Canada, made very broad commitments. Now, it can be argued that Canada has to address this issue more urgently because of our aging population, but that can't be the entire story. Many countries are facing similar demographic projections to Canada, but they haven't moved forward with liberalizing labor mobility in the way that we have. Now, this trend has current as well as future policy implications. For example, in light of action in this country by the current U.S. administration on the H-1B visa program, Canada is increasingly being eyed by business as a potential location for international IT hubs, a country where skilled labor can reliably enter in order to work on contracts, gain experience, or simply meet, without major concerns that employees will be turned away at the border. And in a future focused on trade and services, this could be a real opportunity for us. So, in closing, I want to leave you with a gravity model of trade, that is. And I believe that the gravity model of trade will be more relevant than ever for North American trade moving forward. Simply put, the gravity model states that the larger a country's GDP and the shorter the distance to its trade partner, the more likely those countries will trade. A recent post by Tom Startup of the Wake Up Foundation outlines the reasons he believes that a post-Brexit UK will need to continue to look to Europe for trade, and I think many of those ideas apply to the current North American context. And while Canada is projected to be the poor cousin of North America by 2030, meaning perhaps our GDP will make us less attractive a trading partner than Mexico and the United States, our established trade relationships and networks, our shared language and cultural attitudes towards business, and most importantly, the fact that you can see my country from this building, reinforce, from my perspective, the importance of our regional trading bloc growing over time. So thanks very much for your time.
You're right, Dr. Lilly, that the last spot of the day is not the easiest spot. Thank you very much for being here and for a fascinating conversation. We really appreciate it. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us throughout the day. That was our concluding event for the day. We'll meet back here. The reception was originally intended to start at 6 p.m. We're going to move that until 6:30 to give everyone just a little bit of time off before we gather back in the room where the